The winter of 1886 came early to Custer County, Montana Territory, and it came without apology. By the second week of November, the Missouri River bottoms were locked in ice so thick that freight wagons crossed where canoes had run in September. The grass, what was left of it after a summer that hit 108 degrees in Miles City and sent streams to dust, was sealed under a crust of ice too hard for cattle hooves to break. 300,000 head of cattle stood on Montana ranges that could barely support a third of them, and the sky every morning had that flat, tin grey colour the old-timers called looking like more. Hanna Kvist looked at that sky and started counting firewood. She had 31 cords stacked against the north wall of her claim shanty, split and cured since August. 31 cords sounds like a lot until you understand the math of a Dakota Plains winter in a board and batten shanty with gaps in the walls you could push 3 fingers through. A claim shanty runs through 2 to 3 cords a month. In ordinary cold, January 1887 was not going to be ordinary cold. Hanna had been on her claim for 2 years by then, long enough to know the feel of the wind off the Yellowstone in November, long enough to watch what happened to the men who'd built their cabins fast and figured warm enough was good enough. She was 24 years old, the daughter of a Norwegian father and a Cree Ojibwe mother, and she had $3.17 to her name after paying the filing fee on her 160-acre claim the previous spring. Born in 1862 at the Pembina settlement on the Red River, she'd grown up watching her mother's family build with bark the way her father's people built with timber. She understood both traditions. She was about to need them both. What Hanna built that fall, wrapping her 1.2 by 1.6 claim shanty in 3 inches of layered birch bark, stripped from the cottonwood-choked draws along Pumpkin Creek, looked ridiculous to every settler in the Musselshell Valley. It looked like a crazy woman had decided to shingle her cabin with river trash. Wilhelm Schraft, who ran the largest cattle operation in the county from a proper timber-framed house with a cast-iron Comstock stove that could burn 50 pounds of coal in a night, walked over one afternoon in October and stood there looking at her work with his hands on his hips. "Miss Kvist," he said, "that bark'll come off in the first real blow. You're wasting the autumn you should be spending on your woodpile." She kept layering bark. Before this winter was done, the Schraft cattle operation would lose 71% of its herd. The timber house would survive, the cast-iron stove would survive, and 3 of his ranch hands would spend 2 weeks at the Billings Hospital with frostbite from repeatedly going out to find cattle that were already dead under the drifts. Hanna Kvist's shanty held 52 degrees Fahrenheit on the coldest night of the winter, burning less than 1.5 cords of wood across the entire 60-day freeze. To understand what she did, you have to understand what log and board construction actually does in extreme cold, because the settlers building cabins across the northern plains in 1886 had a fundamental misunderstanding about why their walls failed. They thought the problem was thickness. Build the walls thicker, use bigger logs, and you'd stay warm. So a man who could afford it used 8-inch logs, and a man who couldn't used rough-sawn boards. Both of them were working with materials that conduct heat slowly, but steadily to the outside, like a hole draining a bathtub. The thicker the log, the slower the drain. But with temperatures outside at minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit and a goal of 60 degrees Fahrenheit inside, a 100 degree differential pushes heat through almost anything. A softwood log pine, cottonwood, fir has a thermal resistance of about R1-2 per inch of thickness. An 8-inch log wall is R9-6. That sounds reasonable until January arrives. At 40 degrees Fahrenheit outside and 60 degrees Fahrenheit inside, an R9-6. Wall loses roughly 10 British thermal units per hour for every square foot of wall surface. A cabin with 400 square feet of wall surface loses 4,000 British thermal units per hour through the logs alone. An average cast-iron box stove burning dry wood puts out about 12,000 British thermal units per hour at full output, which means a third of your stove's entire heat output is bleeding out through the logs before you account for anything else. The logs were not even the worst part. As green timber dried in the first winter after construction, it shrank. Logs that had butted tight against each other in October had gaps in February that let wind cut through like a knife, chinking the clay, moss, animal hair, or rags packed between logs dried and cracked through the same freeze-thaw cycles that cracked the wood. Settlers stuffed newspapers into the gaps, then rags, then old clothing. By the third week of January, 1,887, families across the Musselshell Valley were waking up to find ice on the inside of their cabin walls, not because they'd run out of wood yet, but because air at 40 degrees Fahrenheit was pouring through gaps their chinking no longer filled, and no stove can fight cold air moving freely through a wall. Heat lost to air, infiltration doesn't respond to more wood on the fire. It responds only to blocking the air. Hanna Kvist understood this in her bones, though she didn't have the engineering vocabulary for it. She had watched it happen before. She came to Custer County in the fall of 1,884 with $31 and a hammerhead horse named Berta, after 3 years working as a domestic servant in Bismarck for a family named Bergstrom. The Bergstroms were decent employers. She ate at the kitchen table, had Sundays free, but domestic service was not what she had come to Dakota Territory for. The Homestead Act offered 160 acres to any citizen who filed a claim, built a 1 2x1 2 shelter, and worked the land for 5 years. Women could file. Hanna was a citizen through her father's naturalization. She filed on a section of land along a south-facing draw on Pumpkin Creek in October 1884, paid the $14 filing fee, and began building. Her first structure was the smallest shelter that qualified under the Homestead Act, 12 feet by 16 rough-sawn boards from the Billings lumber yard at $30 per 1,000 board feet. She spent $22 on lumber and nails. The remaining $9 went toward a small sheet iron stove, a used one she bought from a man at the Forsyth trading post for $7, leaving her with $2. She survived her first winter on small game, dried beans, and about 2.5 cords of wood she'd spent September and October cutting herself from the dead timber along the creek. The shanty was cold. There was no other word for it. January 1,885 brought 3 weeks of temperatures below -20 degrees Fahrenheit, and she burned wood faster than she'd estimated. On the coldest nights, she slept in her coat and wool cap, pulled her 2 blankets up over her head, and let the stove go out so as not to exhaust the woodpile. She woke on February 4 to find her water bucket sealed with 2 inches of ice, and she sat up in the grey light and thought about what she was going to do differently. What she did differently required a walk. 2 miles south of her claim, along the creek, there was a family of Cree Ojibwe people who wintered in the draws every year, the same draws the ranchers used because the cottonwood and willow broke the wind. The family's name, as near as Hannah's neighbours could pronounce it, was Swifthawk, and the matriarch of the family, a woman in her 60s who went by the English name Margaret, had watched the settler cabins go up for a decade and said very little about them. Margaret spoke some English, and Hannah's Ojibwe was halting but workable, inherited from her mother and summers spent at Pembina. They had met twice before, once when Hannah's horse had gone lame and Margaret's son had helped her get back to the claim. Once when Hanna had traded a bag of dried beans for a pair of moccasins. She desperately needed that winter. In the early spring of 1,885, Hanna walked down to the draw and sat with Margaret for most of an afternoon. She didn't ask for designs or explanations. She just watched what Margaret was doing, repairing the birch bark covering of the family's lodge, stitching large sheets of bark back onto the frame with basswood fibre, where a February windstorm had worked a corner loose. The sheets were flexible, each one about 3 feet wide, and varying in length from 4 feet to 8 feet, stacked 6 layers deep in the sections that faced north and west. Hanna picked up a loose piece and bent it, surprised by how it moved without cracking. She held it up and looked at the laminated layers, dozens of paper-thin sheets compressed into something 1/8 of an inch thick, like a book made of skin. Margaret glanced at her and said, in English, "Better than your boards." Hanna said nothing. She watched for another hour, helped stitch 2 sheets back into place when Margaret indicated where she wanted her to hold, and walked home. She spent the spring and summer of 1885 improving her shanty with standard materials. She banked sod against the north wall, added a second layer of boards on the east side, rechinked every gap she could find with a clay and grass mixture she mixed herself. The second winter was warmer, though still difficult. The third winter, 1886, she was going to do something different. Birch bark comes off a living tree in late spring, when the sap runs just beneath the bark and the bark itself separates cleanly. June in the Mussel Shell Valley. Hanna worked for 3 weeks, pulling bark from white birch and paper birch along the creek draws, stripping it in sheets as wide as her arm span and as long as she could manage without tearing. The large pieces went 16 feet long, and the small pieces were still useful. She stacked them flat under a canvas, weighted them down with stones so they'd dry without curling, and worked toward a number she'd calculated through the winter. To wrap her 1.2 by 1.6 shanty 4 walls, each about 7 feet high, she needed approximately 560 square feet of coverage. She wanted 3 inches of layered bark on each wall, which at roughly 5 sheets per inch meant 15 layers across that 560 square feet. The math came out to approximately 8,400 square feet of bark sheets, which sounds impossible until you remember that many of those sheets were large, and that bark from a 1.2 inch birch comes in sheets 2 feet wide. In practice, she estimated she needed somewhere around 400 to 500 large sheets. She got close to 380. It wasn't the full 3 inches she'd wanted everywhere. The north wall got the most, about 20 sheets stacked and overlapped, roughly 4 inches of total thickness. The east and west walls got 15 sheets each. The south wall, which faced into the sun on clear days and already had her woodpile stacked against part of it, got 10. She spent 12 days in October nailing the first layer directly to her board walls, using small square-headed nails at the corners and top edge of each sheet, leaving the bottom loose to shed water. Each subsequent layer went over the previous one, offset by half a sheet width, so that no seam aligned across layers. The physical work was considerable. Bent at the ladder, holding bark with one hand and nailing with the other, climbing down to reposition, then back up again. Rain one day in the second week made the outer layers stiff and resistant. She hit her thumb twice with the hammer, badly enough to bruise it black. She ran out of nails on the 11th day and rode to Forsyth for more, a 16-mile round trip that ate one afternoon. When it was finished, the shanty looked strange. The bark was pale grey-white on the outer layers where it had dried, with dark veins of birch pattern. The corners were messy. She'd had to fold and cut sheets to fit, and folded bark wants to spring back. She'd weighted the corner folds with battens of scrap wood nailed over them. From 20 feet away, the building looked like something between a cabin and an enormous paper wasp nest. Wilhelm Schraft stopped his horse on the road and stared for a full 30 seconds before he spoke. "Miss Kvist, that bark won't do a thing when the cold gets in behind it." She asked him what he meant by "gets in behind it." "Wind'll work right through bark. It's not a solid material." This was the part he had wrong, and the part most of them had wrong, and the reason the distinction mattered would become completely clear in about 60 days. Bark is not a solid material in the way a brick is solid, and that is precisely the point. Each layer of paper birch bark is itself a laminate dozens of cell layers, compressed into a sheet that looks, under a magnifying glass, like the pages of a book pressed tight together. Between every two of those paper-thin layers, there is a microscopic pocket of trapped air that cannot circulate, cannot carry heat from one surface to another, and cannot do anything except sit there acting as an insulating barrier. Moving air conducts heat aggressively. It's why wind chill is lethal. A 30 miles per hour's wind at 20 degrees Fahrenheit strips heat off a human body at the same rate as still air at minus 68 degrees Fahrenheit. The air itself isn't colder, but it's moving, and moving air drags heat away from surfaces continuously. This is convection, and it's the primary mechanism that kills people in winter. Still air, by contrast, is a terribly conductor. At standard pressure, still air has a thermal conductivity of about 0.025 watts per meter per degree, roughly 5 times less conductive than pine wood. When you trap air in small enough pockets that it cannot circulate, it becomes a genuine insulator. This is what makes fiberglass insulation work. The glass fibers themselves conduct heat reasonably well, but they create millions of tiny pockets of still air between them. And it's the air that does the actual insulating. Birch bark does the same thing, using a structure the tree grew over decades, rather than one manufactured in a factory. A single sheet of paper birch bark, measured in modern laboratory conditions, has a thermal conductivity of roughly 0.06 to 0.08 watts per meter per degree, still better than pine wood, and dramatically better than the gap-riddled boards of a frontier shanty. When you layer 15 sheets together, the performance compounds. The air pockets between sheets add to the air pockets within sheets, and each interface between two bark surfaces creates a new zone of still air that moving wind cannot penetrate. Schraft was thinking of wind going through a screen. If the screen isn't solid, the wind gets through. But bark layers aren't a screen, they're a stack of pages. Wind at the outer surface of the bark shell meets the first layer, which slows it. The still air between layers can't be accelerated by the outer wind because there's no open passage. By the time any air movement reaches the fourth or fifth layer inward, it's essentially stopped. The interior of the bark stack sees almost no wind-driven convection. Hanna's layered bark shell was not, in modern terms, a spectacular insulator. 3 to 4 inches of layered birch bark achieves somewhere in the range of R7 to R11, depending on how tightly the sheets lie and how much air is trapped between them. Her existing board wall added perhaps R2, so she was working with a total assembly of roughly R9 to R13. That's not remarkable by modern standards, but it was between 2 and 4 times the insulating value of the standard R6 to R9 log or board wall the other settlers had built, and unlike the log walls, her bark shell had no gaps, no cracked chinking, and no seams that dried out over winter. The bark's suberin and betulin content, compounds that together make up more than half of birch bark's dry weight, made the outer layers naturally waterproof. Snow that fell against the wall didn't soak through. Ice didn't work its way into cracks, expand, and open new gaps. What was sealed in October was still sealed in February. That last part was the difference that Schraft hadn't considered and couldn't have, because he'd never thought to look at his own cabin wall in February and count the gaps. November 16 arrived with an ice storm that sealed every blade of grass on the range under a 1/4 inch of glaze. The cattle could smell the grass but couldn't reach it. They walked in tightening circles and lost weight. Ranchers drove their herds toward the creek bottoms where cottonwood bark sometimes supplemented grass, but there wasn't enough cottonwood in the mussel shell drainage for the number of animals that needed it. Hanna watched all of this from the edge of her claim, her 6 head of cattle already penned in the small barn she'd built the previous spring, a structure she'd also wrapped in bark on the north and west faces. She'd cut and stored 800 pounds of prairie hay from her south meadow and had another 400 pounds of dried cottonwood bark and branches. She was not going to let her animals out to compete with Schraft's 340 cattle on ground that couldn't feed 1/3 of them. The first blizzard hit November 22. The temperature dropped to minus 38 degrees Fahrenheit at Forsyth on November 24 and held there for 4 days. Inside Hannah's shanty, she was burning approximately 8 pounds of wood per hour on the coldest hours, roughly a third less than she'd burned the previous winter during equivalent cold, because she'd gone from losing around 4,000 BTU per hour through walls to losing closer to 2,500 British thermal units. The difference compounds. Over a 4-day cold snap, it's roughly 60 pounds of wood she did not have to burn, and that's not trivial when your woodpile needs to last 60 more days. December brought 2 more blizzards. Fort Keogh at Miles City recorded 30 degrees Fahrenheit on December 18. Fort Yates in Dakota Territory hit 44 degrees Fahrenheit. In the river valleys, drifts piled 15 feet against the bluffs, and cattle drifted south before the wind and stacked against fence lines and coulees until they froze standing upright. Theodore Roosevelt's Elkhorn Ranch on the Little Missouri lost more than half its cattle in December alone. He later wrote that he had never seen so many dead animals in his life. The losses arrived not as dramatic single events, but as slow accumulation. But an animal gone this morning, 2 more by afternoon, the living ones too weak to respond when you drove them toward shelter. Hannah checked her woodpile on December 31. She'd burned just under a cord. At that rate, her 31 cords would last the winter 3 times over. But she also understood that January was not going to look like December. The 9th of January 1887 started cold enough, around 22 degrees Fahrenheit at Forsyth, and then it got worse. 16 inches of snow fell in 16 hours. Drifts buried fence lines and erased the trails between claims. On January 12, the temperature at Bismarck fell to minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit, and the barometric pressure dropped sharply enough that old-timers said they felt it in their joints. In Miles City, stock pens collapsed under snow loads and horses broke through ice they'd walked across in December. Hannah had gone into semi-isolation 10 days earlier, making a calculated decision. The risk of being caught outside in a sudden wind shift was greater than the discomfort of staying in. She'd stored enough supplies inside: dried beef, dried beans, cornmeal, a 10-gallon water barrel, her woodpile to last 3 weeks without going out for anything except to feed and water the animals, which meant a 30-foot walk to the barn twice a day. She'd strung a rope from the shanty door to the barn door so she could find the barn in 0 visibility conditions. The interior of the shanty held at around 54 degrees Fahrenheit, with the stove running about a third of its capacity. On the worst nights, January 14 and 15, when Forsyth recorded minus 46 degrees Fahrenheit, she stoked the stove to full output for 3-hour windows at bedtime and again at 5 a.m., and the interior temperature dropped no lower than 47 degrees Fahrenheit at its worst. 3 miles south, the Shraft Ranch House was fighting a losing battle. The cast-iron Comstock stove was consuming 50 to 60 pounds of coal per night. Shraft had laid in 2 tons of coal, enough, he'd thought, for the winter. By January 20, he had less than half of it left, and the ranch house on its worst nights was dropping to 28 degrees Fahrenheit at floor level, even with the stove running all night. Because the chinking had cracked out of the east wall in 3 places, and wind at 40 degrees Fahrenheit doesn't care how big your stove is when it's moving freely through an 8-inch gap. He sent a hand to the Billings coal yard. The roads were impassable. The Great Blizzard came on January 28 and lasted through February 3, 6 days and 5 nights of 0 visibility and wind that measured 60 miles per hour at the Billings weather station. The temperature at Fort Assiniboine hit minus 55.4 degrees Fahrenheit on February 1. Bismarck registered minus 43 degrees Fahrenheit on February 1 and again on February 12. A weather observer in the Musselshell Valley noted that on the morning of February 1, the thermometer on his north porch, sheltered from direct wind, read 51 degrees Fahrenheit. He went inside and didn't go out again for 4 days. Hanna had the rope to the barn. Twice a day she pulled herself along it, hand over hand, through wind that made walking in a straight line impossible, to give her 6 cattle water from a pail she carried out from the shanty, and hay from the pile she'd stored inside the barn rather than outside it. All 6 animals survived. 4 of them were in reasonable condition when it was over, and 2 had lost weight they'd spend March recovering. On February 2, at approximately 3 inches the afternoon, someone knocked on her door. She opened it to find 2 of Schraff's ranch hands, Brendan McCready and a Métis man everyone called Dupuis, standing in the wind with ice in their beards and their hands wrapped in burlap feed sacks because their gloves had soaked through and frozen. They'd walked 3 miles in minus 50 degrees Fahrenheit wind. McCready's right foot, they discovered later, had frostbite in 2 toes. Schraff had sent them because the ranch house was down to 26 degrees Fahrenheit, coal was gone, and the wood stove they'd converted to burning scrap lumber and broken furniture was not keeping pace with the air coming through the east wall. 2 of the ranch hands were showing signs of hypothermia. Could Miss Kvist spare any wood? She could. She did. She gave them 12 pieces of split birch about 30 pounds and pointed at her woodpile, still stacked high and mostly covered by the snow that had drifted against the south wall. She told them to take what they could carry. McCready took as much as he could manage with his damaged hands. Dupuis built a travois from 2 scrapboards and loaded it with another 80 pounds, which they dragged back to the ranch through the storm. She did not explain her woodpile. She did not explain the bark. She did not tell them what she'd done or why she had wood to spare when Schraff, with his $800 cast iron stove and his $200 coal supply, was burning furniture. She gave them the wood and went back inside. Wilhelm Schraff came himself 4 days later, when the great blizzard had finally died enough to walk in. He stood outside her door and she let him in and gave him coffee, real coffee, not the ersatz chicory most settlers were drinking by February, and he looked at the inside of her shanty. It was 53 degrees Fahrenheit. He could see his breath faintly, but only faintly. He was wearing 2 coats. He looked at the wall. From the inside, it looked exactly like a board wall. She hadn't done anything to the interior except hang old burlap feed sacks for additional insulation in the coldest corners. He looked at her woodpile through the window, still substantial. "How?" he said. She took him outside and peeled back a corner of bark on the east wall, where a bottom sheet had lifted slightly from an ice build-up underneath. He looked at the layers, the white outer sheets, the reddish-brown inner sheets, the cross-section of 15 overlapping layers at the edge where she'd cut them to fit around the window frame. "That's bark," he said. "Yes, paper birch, yes." He stood there for a moment looking at it. Then he said, "I've got 87 cattle still alive. I need to build a shelter for them. Could you show me how to do this?" She could. She did. They spent 3 days in March. After the Chinook winds finally came and the temperature climbed above 0 for the first time since late December, stripping remaining bark from the creek bottoms and wrapping the south wall of his largest cattle barn. It was too late for that winter, but the barn they built together in 1887 was still standing in 1924, and a rancher who bought the Schraff property in 1921 noted in his purchase records that the south wall of the old cattle barn had some kind of bark lining on it that he'd never seen anywhere else and couldn't figure out the purpose of. The final accounting of the big die-up, as it came to be called, emerged through the spring roundups of 1,887. The Montana Stock Growers Association reported that the territory had lost approximately 362,000 head of cattle, roughly 60% of the entire herd. Specific operations varied. Conrad Cause's operation lost 50%, Granville Stewart's lost 60 to 72%, and Nelson Story's lost 75%. The Marquis de Moraes, who'd built an elaborate meatpacking facility at Medora in Dakota Territory and staked his fortune on the open-range cattle business, lost nearly everything and returned to France. Theodore Roosevelt spent that winter at his Elkhorn Ranch on the Little Missouri and lost at least 60% of his herd, a financial blow large enough that he eventually concluded the Dakota cattle venture had failed. He wrote to his sister that he wished he could be sure of losing no more than half what he'd invested. He came back to New York and turned to politics and writing. The West, he wrote much later, had taught him lessons he couldn't have learned anywhere else. And one of those lessons was almost certainly about what 40 degrees Fahrenheit actually means when you're the one trying to keep living things warm through it. Bismarck's temperature records for December 1886 through February 1887 show the only winter in the city's 150-year climate record where the 3-month average temperature was below 0 Fahrenheit, 0.6 degrees below zero, to be precise, across the entire 3 months. The sustained extreme cold ran from approximately December 20 through late February, a period of roughly 60 days during which temperatures rarely climbed above zero and blizzards were nearly continuous. The Blackfoot Agency weatherlog noted snow on all but 3 days of February 1887. Hanna Kvist's woodpile was still more than half full on March 1. What she had built was not, in the vocabulary of materials science, a high-performance insulation system. She was not an engineer, and she was not trying to minimize heat loss per unit area to any particular specification. She was trying to solve a problem she'd been cold enough, for long enough, to understand in her muscles and her sleep-interrupted nights. The problem was not, primarily, that her boards couldn't hold heat. The problem was that the gaps between her boards, gaps that opened and widened through freeze-thaw cycles, through green lumber drying, through wind loading, were letting outside air in continuously, and outside air in January, 1,887 inches, Custer County, Montana, was lethal. Bark doesn't gap. A layered bark shell pressed against a board wall fills every irregularity in the board surface, covers every gap between boards, and presents the outside wind with a continuous, flexible, waterproof surface that has no chinking to crack and no joints to open. When a wind at 50 degrees Fahrenheit hits layered birch bark, it hits something that will not let it through. The air in those bark layers is still. The stove's heat stays inside longer. The wood lasts longer. The animals in the barn survive when the animals in open drifts do not. 3 inches of layered birch bark provides approximately R7, 5 to R11 of thermal resistance, depending on how tightly the layers sit and how much interstitial air they trap. Her board wall added roughly R2 more. Her total wall assembly was somewhere around R9 to R13, not remarkable by any modern standard, but between 2 and 4 times the effective insulation of her neighbours' standard walls, once you account for the air infiltration those walls permitted. The birch bark cost her nothing except labour. The nails cost $3.17, the exact amount she had in cash in October 1886, paid to the hardware man at Forsyth for 2 pounds of square-cut nails. Her cash on hand when the winter ended, $0. Her cattle, 6 alive, 4 healthy, 2 recovering. Her wood, 16 cords remaining from the 31 she'd started with. This was knowledge that had been sitting in the creek bottoms a 2-mile walk from her claim for decades. Margaret's family had wintered in those same drawers for at least 40 years, in structures that looked to the settlers riding past, like something temporary and crude. The Ojibwe wigwam, the bark-covered lodge frame that Great Lakes peoples had built for centuries, used exactly this layering principle. Sheets of paper birch stacked 3 to 6 layers deep on a bent sapling frame, stitched with basswood fibre, producing a structure that could hold comfortable temperatures through Canadian winters with a small central fire. Scandinavian settlers in the Northern Territories knew a version of the same technique. The Norwegian torvtak, or sod roof, was fundamentally a birch bark roof. 6 to 16 layers of bark applied directly to the rafters, with sod placed on top for additional mass. The bark was the waterproofing and the sod was the weight that held it and added insulation. Settlers with Norwegian heritage were building this way in Minnesota and the Dakotas through the 1880s. Hanna Kvist's insight, if it can be called that, was applying the principle to a wall rather than a roof, and understanding that the same layering logic worked laterally, that wind hitting a wall from the side was subject to the same physics as rain hitting a roof from above. Buffalo Bird Woman, a Hidatsa woman born around 1839 at the Knife River villages in Dakota Territory, spent decades describing her people's construction knowledge to anthropologist Gilbert L. Wilson, who published it beginning in 1917, her people's earth lodges massive structures 30 to 60 feet in diameter, dug partially into the ground and roofed with willow, grass, and several feet of packed earth regularly held 40 to 50 people and animals through the same Dakota winters that were killing settlers in shanties. The Hidatsa had been refining cold climate construction on the northern plains for centuries before the first settler drove a claim stake. The Mandan, Hidatsa, and Arikara earth lodges didn't use birch bark because birch didn't grow abundantly on the upper Missouri. They used a different insulating principle: deep earth berming, thick sod walls, small entry tunnels that trapped cold air before it could enter the main living space. Different material, same physics. The point was always still air, and always sealing the gap between the warm space and the cold wind. The settlers who came to Montana and Dakota Territory in the 1880s knew some of this existed. They could see the earth lodges. They could walk past the creek bottom wigwams. What they couldn't do, mostly, was admit that people they'd been trained to regard as primitive were building more effectively in this climate than they were. That failure of observation cost some of them their herds and their homestead claims. It cost a few of them their lives. Hanna Kvist was the daughter of a Norwegian man and a Cree Ojibwe woman, which put her in an interesting position. She was part of the settler economy. She had a Homestead Act claim. She paid cash for nails. She traded at Forsyth, and she had a direct line to knowledge that the settler economy couldn't see. She used both. Birch bark as a building insulator was not a primitive answer that better materials have since replaced. It was a genuinely good insulator in the range of sheep wool and cork that worked because it trapped still air in a waterproof, flexible, rot-resistant matrix. Modern building science rediscovered the importance of air sealing in the 1970s energy crisis and has spent the decades since refining what Hanna Kvist accomplished with $3 of nails and a 3-week harvest. The principle she was using has a name now: continuous exterior insulation. It's the recommendation of the U.S. Department of Energy for cold climate buildings. You apply an unbroken layer of insulating material over the entire exterior of a wall assembly, covering every stud, every gap, every thermal bridge, with no seams that align across layers and no point where outdoor air can find a path through to the indoor surface. That is exactly what bark layers, offset and overlapping, accomplish. Passive house construction, the most demanding energy efficiency standard in modern residential building, requires continuous exterior insulation as a core element. Houses built to this standard typically use 3 to 6 inches of rigid foam board or mineral wool on the exterior of the structural wall. The physics are identical to what Hanna built. The material is different. The price is considerably higher than $3.17. In the creek bottoms of Custer County, the birch trees that supplied Hanna's bark are still there. The draw along Pumpkin Creek, where she harvested through 3 June weeks in 1886, still runs white-barked paper birch along its edges. Her claim shanty is long gone. No structure built of rough-sawn boards from the 1880s has survived the intervening century of Montana weather, regardless of what was nailed to its exterior. But the bark on those trees grows in the same overlapping laminate layers it always has. The physics hasn't changed. What Wilhelm Schraft's cast-iron stove could not do, what 2 tons of coal and an $800 appliance couldn't accomplish against 60 days of Montana Territory cold, was seal the gap. It just burned harder. That's not a trivial observation. Burning harder is the answer a lot of people reach for when they're cold and they can afford it, and it's often not the right answer. The right answer is usually the thing that keeps the cold out in the first place, the thing that costs $3.17 in nails, and 3 weeks of your own labour in the birch bark season of the preceding summer. Hanna Kvist filed her final proof on her Custer County homestead in October 1889, 5 years after her original claim. The filing records at the Custer County Courthouse include a notation by the land agent who certified her proof of residence and improvements. 12x16 frame dwelling, sound condition. Bark siding, unusual but appears effective. She got her 160 acres. Her 6 cattle became 31 by 1891. She married a Norwegian immigrant farmer named Tor Halvorsen in 1892, and they worked the claim together until 1918, when they sold it and retired to Billings. The property changed hands 3 more times before it became part of a larger ranch in 1936. The bark shell didn't outlast the building it was nailed to. Wood eventually rots and falls, regardless of what's on the outside, but it outlasted the winter that killed 300,000 cattle and broke the open-range era of the American West. It outlasted the coal supply of the richest rancher in the county. It outlasted every standard approach the settlers had brought with them from places where the cold didn't actually try to kill you. That tends to be what good physics does. It just keeps working, quietly, through things that overwhelm everything else. Compartilhar conteúdo do projeto che niche criado por vocês. Avoid these styles. These styles were used. Text 133 Linus text.